Good evening. I have a honor, a pleasure to introduce to you. Yes, to introduce to you Professor Vitor Oliveira, coming from Portugal, from Porto. Professor is a researcher at the University of Porto and also a professor of urban morphology at Lusófona University in Porto as well. And also he's a president of the so-called International Seminar on Urban Form, which is an international group, a very large group now of academics and practitioners who deal with problems of urban morphology, which is a very important layer, let's say, of research dealing with urban form as a physical form and also as a very deeply related discipline to the history and to the culture. So it is not only about architecture or urbanism or about design or about planning and spatial planning, but also a problem of archaeology, geography, history, etc. So maybe I will give floor to Professor to say more about urban morphology, and I hope you will start to be interested in this wonderful new science. Okay, so
move it around.
Yes, we have a book here on urban morphology written by Professor, and maybe you can have a look at it during or after the lecture. Professor, floor is yours.
So I will start now. The sound is okay? Can I? Okay. So welcome to this session. I will start by thanking Professor Anna Kantarek for the invitation to be in Poland in May and June. It's absolutely amazing for me to come back after my first visit 4 years ago. We know each other from 12 years right now, and we have been working together in the International Seminar on Urban Form, but this is I believe it is our strongest opportunity for collaboration. So again, thank you for inviting me to be here. So today I will be taking one part of the book that is running on the tables that I published 10 years ago as an introduction to the field of urban morphology. Why to publish an introduction to a field? Because I would say that the main strength of urban morphology is also its main weakness, which is the knowledge is spread to many different fields. It is part in architecture, part in geography, another part in history, another part in planning, and we could go on. So the book tries to put together in just one place all you need to know about the field. Of course, all the most important things that you need to know about the field. So the book has been having, I think I can say, it has been a successful attempt. It has been translated to some different languages. The original is in English, but then it was translated to Portuguese, to Persian, to Chinese, to Turkish, and now it is being translated to Russian. And a second edition came out in 2022, and it is an update, but also an expanded edition of the book. So these are simple, apparently simple questions, but also very difficult ones. How can I understand an object as a city, something so complex? There are no straightforward answers. I guess you all agree with me. The book, and especially the field of urban morphology, tries to give us some clues to describe, explain as rigorous as possible, firstly, the physical form of cities, and then how this physical form can influence other aspects of our life. Not all aspects, for sure, and not all elements of urban form have influence on other aspects of urban life, but the field tries to trace, again, as rigorous as possible, some connections that by now we can say do exist. A second very hard question is how can my action on the city, how can my action as architect, urban designer, planner, can be enhanced by the field of urban morphology? So what you see here is the main contents of the book. It is in 7 parts. And today I will focus only on the 5th chapter, which is the one that presents the dominant approaches in the field. And these approaches tend to be quite different one from each other, as it is common in all fields of knowledge. And while in the book I go step by step describing the fundamental aspects of each approach, today I will do something that is a bit different, which is I will not focus on the differences, but on the common ground between these different ways of thinking about cities. Why? Because I strongly believe that no matter how good a theory is, it cannot explain all aspects of a city. So I prefer to understand these different theories as approaches that capture something of the urban reality and try to know as much as possible different approaches to this reality, and if possible, bring them together. Some things we can bring together because they share the common ground. Other things we cannot, but in this talk, in the next minutes, I will focus on how we can build these bridges between these different theories, which I consider some of the most useful for us to describe and explain cities and to prescribe them, thinking that most of us, at least in this room, want to act on the city and not just to understand it. So this is our roadmap for today. The presentation is in 3 parts. The first part draws from geography. I must say that my main influence are geographers, my main influence in the field of urban morphology. And so the first part draws from a German geographer that immigrated to England when the Nazi party rose to power in Germany. I will go into details on his work, but all this first part comes from the research that he has developed in England. Then in the second part, I will be adding different ways of thinking to this framework that is provided by MRG Conzena, that's the name of the geographer. And in the final part, I will try to explain how some of these ideas have been applied into practice. So we start by a very small town in the north of England. I'm sure that most of the audience have never heard about it. And the reason is easy because it's a very common town. It has no particular aspect that would attract international attention. Going back to MRG Conzena, he emigrated to England in 1933. He has just concluded his geography degree, so he was not famous like so many German architects that immigrated to the UK and then to the United States that we admire. So he didn't have an easy life in England, especially after the beginning of the Second World War, where a German citizen would not be most welcome. In this period, he did a planning degree, which is an important aspect of his work because it would add it to that background of geography, an intent to act on the physical form of cities. And that is something that was always important in his work. We can always see some practical application of the concepts that he have developed over time. So when he started teaching, he was based in Newcastle, which is in the north of England, as many of you know. And Alnwick is a very small town in the surroundings of Newcastle. He used to take the weekends to travel around with his wife, and one weekend he passed through this small town of Alnwick, and he was particularly attracted by this image, by this small triangle. You will then see more details in the next slides. And he decided to do a very comprehensive survey on Alnwick. The book on Alnwick was published in 1960. Its name is Alnwick, Northumberland, a study in town plan analysis. It's one of my favorite books in urban morphology, so much that I've devoted 1 year to translate it to Portuguese so that my students could have access to the book. Although I do not recommend it as a start for Conzenian thinking, because it's a very dense book. It's very small, 100 and something pages, but very, very dense. What the book has that is important, it's not so much the information that is about Alnwick, but the concepts, the ideas that are present in Alnwick, but some of them are also present in Porto, the place where I come from, and some of them are also present in Krakow. So is this general things that we can extract from the book and apply to other contexts? All contexts? No, of course, but to some contexts, because over these 6.5 decades since the publication of the book, many researchers around the world become interested by this approach, and they started to develop in different contexts. So here you have an aerial view of what Alnwick is today. As you see, it's not a large territory. It's a small town, so similar to many of the towns that exist in the north of England. It has a small attraction for the young, I would say, for this half of the audience, which is this castle is the castle of Harry Potter. So that is the only thing that is really special in Alnwick. So what are the things that Conzena tell us that are relevant for us? First, a very simple thing, but which I think it's very important because in a way it frames what do we understand by form and how do we look at the form of cities. And this thing is that form is always driven by socioeconomic forces. We can never look at form just by itself. And in the same way, form influences many aspects of a social, economic, and environmental nature. So we cannot look at the issues of form in an isolated way. And as we must relate form with these other key domains, we should also try to understand the relations of a settlement with a regional context, no matter how small the settlement is. And in fact, Anik was very small. When dealing with physical form alone, I would just like to say something else in addition to this. Last week, I was in Famagusta in North Cyprus, and we were having a school of urban morphology, and one of the ladies, in fact, the main lady that organized the workshop, she spent a period of her PhD in England, working not with Conzen, but with his main follower, who was a British geographer named Jeremy Whitehand. And when she returned to North Cyprus after staying in England, specifically in Birmingham, their colleagues asked her, what have you learned with this Conzenian approach? And her answer is so simple, apparently naive, but so powerful. She said that she learned streets, plots, and buildings, which is something that might seem so obvious, but it is a tripartite structure that is at the core of Conzen's book. So after reading this book, we will forget many things about Anik because we don't need that detailed information. But if we really paid attention to the book, we will never look at cities in the same way. We will never look at one piece of city without trying to understand how these different structural things, which are streets, the division of street blocks into plots, and the position of buildings within these plots, how they are put in a place. So this scholar is called Nefter Komert, and I think that her answer is absolutely delicious. So I will repeat it for many years to come. So this combination, of course, we don't see the building footprints here, so we just see the streets and the plots, but this combination between streets, plots, and buildings was what Conzen called the town plan, which means the bidimensional organization of our elements of urban form on a particular site, on a particular topography. And by the way, the triangle that captured the attention of Conzen is this one, so the photograph should be taken around here. So the second thing, and the first thing is more important, this is, I must stress this, so Conzen offered a very structured understanding of the urban landscapes. For him, the most important thing would be this town plan, how we relate our things in the two-dimensional way, not in a sense of a modernist composition where everything must be clean and positioned in a particular, but acknowledging the full complexity, but understanding that our decisions on the ground are absolutely crucial for what we do after that and for the impact that it has on other dimensions. So the second thing would be the building fabric, more obvious to us architects. Usually we take that on board on every studies that we do, and the land uses. Conzen was very concerned about cities. This is just to make a bit stress to the presenter, of course. So Conzen was very concerned with how cities changed over time, because in our analysis we tend to frozen things in one particular time, but that is not truth. Things are always changing, and they change at different scales. The first scale that would capture his attention is the scale of the plot. So for most morphologists, the plot would be the minimum scale of analysis where we could understand relationships between forms and where we could understand changes over time. So what we are seeing in this part of the screen is this plot, so it's always the same plot, but how it changed from 1774 until 1966. 1966 is the beginning of the survey that Conzena developed. So what we can see is that this is a very narrow and long plot, typical of many medieval cities. For instance, in my city, that would be the common plot that we could find at the time. And we can see that, oops. Okay. So we can see that the main building of the plot is here, facing this Fenkel Street, so here. And in the two first periods, we can just identify some extension in the main building, so nothing particularly important. But when it comes to the mid of the 19th century, we can see that the whole back of the plot was filled with these small houses for the working class people. So a high number of people were being attracted to the north of England, mostly Irish people. And the owner of this plot, which is Mr. Teasdale, understood that it could take advantage of that situation and could improve his financial situation. And so we can find in 1849 this huge presence of small houses. Again, as I said in the beginning, it's great to have this knowledge on Anik, but it's even more interesting to find that in our cities, for instance, in my city, this is called ilhas, these small houses that appear in the back of the plot, more or less with the same size within a plot that is also of similar size. So throughout the 19th century, it continued more or less the same thing, in the beginning of the 20th also, and we can see that in the last image, all the houses were demolished, maybe because there was not this housing need at the time, maybe because it became a bit unsustainable for this society to have such a large number of people living in so poor conditions. But the fact is that we can find here this incredible change. And for us to realize this change, we must focus not only on what we see on the streets, not only on what we see on the main buildings, but to have this comprehensive look on cities. Conzena called this the Burgage cycle because of the nature of the phenomenon, and Burgage because the main building was owned by a bourgeois. So Conzena realized that another interesting level of analysis would be, I'm trying to understand how this happened, but I didn't identify the pattern so far. And here he was looking at patterns. This is all about pattern identification, and what these different colors mean is a certain homogeneity in terms of the combination of streets, plots, and buildings. For instance, one pattern, and it doesn't call it pattern, it calls it plan units. One modernist plan unit would be a unit that is made of regular streets, very large street blocks that are mainly non-subdivided, or that are just subdivided into one or two plots, and which the buildings are standing free in their plots. So this would be, for instance, looking at this, we could probably see it in the green units. Another plan unit could be a medieval one that would be made not of regular streets, but of more organic, following the topography. We would have a huge number of plots, and we would have buildings facing the street. So if you paid attention to these descriptions, you understand how different they are and what is trying to identify here. Each of these plan units would be usually related to a particular period of time. So that is how change is included in this identification of plan units. And finally, another concept that is related to change is a concept that captures the whole city, or even, as I will show in one of the next slides, something bigger than the city, like a metropolitan area. So this is a concept named fringe belt, and more explicitly than the other two concepts of Burgage cycle and plan unit, in fringe belts, we are mostly looking at process and not so much to form, although we look at form. But the most important thing is the process. So very roughly, cities have different rhythms of growth. They do not grow in the same way over time. They have good periods like us, where they mainly expand through residential tissues. But these good rhythms do not last forever. Cities face financial crises, they face geographical constraints, and so this residential expansion would decrease or it would stop. In the case of medieval times, geographical constraint would be, for instance, a city wall. Okay? So this would be the first residential core of ANIC. And what you see in black, it's a number of plots of very different size that wouldn't need to have a central location because of its activities. For instance, this building where we are would be part of such a fringe belt. It would be far from the city because the people that lived, and people, it's very, the special people that lived here didn't need to be located within the city. So here, these fringe belts, these belts of non-residential use that would form around the residential core would be constituted by more exceptional uses that are not residence, uses like institutional or industrial or just open spaces. And they would be usually aggregated along something that Conzen calls a fixation line, which in the case of those black plots would be the city wall, but in more contemporary times could be, for instance, the construction of a ring road that would make a lot of plots surrounding the ring road to have a non-residential use. So this would be a conceptual diagram of this concept of fringe belt. So first an old core, then the frozen of expansion or the slow expansion, and we would have the first fringe belt that he calls the inner fringe belt. Then after many years, a new residential expansion that does not erase the fringe belt, at least in a first moment. Then through time, it starts to introduce some ruptures. Then this second residential expansion, which is clearly different from the fringe belt, but in a way, it's also different from the first residential area because it's constructed in a different time, and so on and so on. So this model was, or this concept, this conceptual drawing was prepared by Jeremy Whitehand, which is another key figure in the field of urban morphology. He started to teach with Conzena in the early 60s, and while the work of Conzena was mainly an individual contribution, Jeremy Whitehand made of this a real school of thought shared by many people. And in terms of individual contribution, Jeremy Whitehand devoted all his life to the concept of fringe belt. So we could see here, this is his first paper on fringe belts, published in 1967. He was less than 30 years, and he was attracted by the concept, and he thought that he could expand it from the analysis of the small town of Annick to the whole metropolitan area of Newcastle. So you can see how ambitious he was. And throughout his life, he has showed relations of a different nature on what we can get from analyzing fringe belts. So here, just an example of a study on the ecological significance of these elements. And another key input of Jeremy Whitehand was the fact that he brought to this Conzenian way of thinking a more explicit consideration of the agents that are involved in this transformation over time. So if we can simplify something that is not simple, Conzena was mainly concerned on form and processes, and Jeremy Whitehand added to this agents. So this Conzenian thinking started to be about form, process, and agents. So here we see a study that collects these two interests. So Jeremy Whitehand is looking at the fringe belt, at one of the fringe belts on Birmingham, and is looking at a high number of plots that make the fringe belt, and is trying to understand the individual decisions that take place in each of the plots to have a real comprehensive knowledge of how these structures are changed over time, how they resist to transformation, because these are usually plots that are very attractive to real estate. For instance, imagine within this structure there are surely some former industrial sites that stopped their industrial function. They are not used in that way. So they are just expecting to be transformed. And so for real estate industry, these are critical plots. And Jeremy is looking at all this in this study. So far, what I've showed you is just part of the same framework of thinking, mostly by MRG Conzena, but also in these last slides by Jeremy Whitehand. So a very united way of thinking about cities. But now in these next slides, I would like to add some layers of a different kind of nature. And I would like to start by something called space syntax. Maybe some of you have heard about it before. What you see here is the same city, Ludlow, again, a small city in England. In that part of the slide, you see a map of morphological regions designed by Conzena. What is a morphological region? It follows the same logic of plan units. It's just about pattern identification, but while plan units only consider the two-dimensional combination, morphological regions, in addition to the two-dimensional combination, they also look at the building fabric and at land uses. So this would be a typical Conzenian map of understanding of a city, and this would be one of the possible maps coming out from space syntax community. For space syntax, at least in its most pure essence, we could understand many things about cities if we just focus on streets and nothing else. And it is possible to make a link between both approaches, and many researchers have done this link over time because, as I told you in the beginning, Conzena and Jeremy Whitehand had a very hierarchical way of understanding how urban landscapes are structured, and for them, streets were also the most important, but not the only thing, and this is a very important distinction. So the best way of start thinking about space syntax is by looking at the interior of buildings. The theory was developed for both, for understanding the architectural space within a building and the urban space in the city. But it's easier to start by the building. So what we see here is 3 buildings. They all have the same form and size. They are all divided into these 9 rooms with the same form and size. And the only thing that changes is the existence of doors. So for space syntax, the critical thing would be to understand space by itself, space within a building and space in the exterior of the city. So the challenge for us architects, it's very hard because we are asked to forget about materials, about the walls, and to consider only how one space is related to another. And this focus on space was based on a key understanding that one very important aspect of our life in cities or in buildings is how we are in space, how we move through space, and how easy it is for us to move in space. So what we can see in this very simple, illustrative first look is that the first building, it's very rigid. It doesn't allow us, it doesn't give us much options. It just invites us to go from one room to another, to another, to another, without options. We just go, we just follow this sequence. And we can say that because of that, the space that is created in the room is very deep. The other two, building B and building C, although they have some differences between them, they are a bit different from this, and they start to give us opportunities for choice immediately from the beginning. For instance, we enter into this. Today we were talking in the morning about the interior of apartments and how good it would be to have a first hall, and after being in this wall to have some opportunities for distribution. So here we can see that contrarily to the first, where we have to go this and this, here we can decide these different ways of moving through the building. Is this very important? I would say that at this scale, no, it is not. But the thing becomes more interesting when we increase the scale of a building, when we start to talk about complex buildings like a school or a hospital or a parliament, and we try to understand how these spaces are used. So what we see here is in this map is not real. It's not the real movement. It's just a calculation of a software, and the software takes into consideration just the position of rooms and the existence of doors. So this is Tate Gallery in London, and it is not considering if in one of these rooms I have a painting by Salvador Dali or by Picasso. It just considers the relations between the different rooms. The colors that you see are the usual colors that the space syntax community uses, and they go from red, meaning the high probability, again, this is not real, the high probability, the high potential of people to move within that space. It goes from red to orange, yellow, green, light blue, and dark blue, meaning the less probability to get people in that room. So this is the potential, and here we have the real movement. This is the representation of 100 people getting into the Tate Gallery, and each time that one person gets inside the gallery, a student follows the person and traces all the paths, and this is an overlap of all the paths. Are these two things equal? No, they are not, but there is a quite promising similarity. And again, as many people since the 60s started to use Keynesian thinking to understand cities, also a large group of interest of researchers started to use these ideas that were initially created in London by a researcher named Bill Hillier and another one named Julian Hansen, and they started to apply in different geographical contexts. For me, it's even more interesting when we go from complex buildings to cities, and we start to have an idea of the potential of some streets to receive people and the probability of others not to have such kind of attractiveness. Again, this is the potential. It would be very hard to have, well, in these days, maybe it is possible, I don't know. But when the map was done, it was not possible. So this is the potential. And again, what you see in red is the structure of London. And these are the streets that, considering the whole system, are likely to have more people. If they have or not, that is a different subject. And another key thing that is important to mention here is that a number of important things are not considered. For instance, topography is not considered. What happens in both sides of the street are not considered. The fact that in this side I have only single family houses, and in this side I have large towers, it's not considered. Or the fact that I have one university or only one house, it is not taken into account in this calculation. So it's just how one street is related to all the others. And because of that, some researchers, even within the space syntax community, started to think that it was too much. It was great in the first years to really, I wouldn't say impose, but to propose a new theory. But some researchers were arguing that maybe this understanding of cities could be complemented by something else. And one of the most interesting proposals came from Stockholm by two researchers named Lars Marcus and Alexander Stahl, and they took on board the plots that were so much of interest to Conzena and to Whitehand. And they have created this. I have to say that this slide is not very good because that part, it sounds much more attractive, but you have to forget the issue of representation and just to consider that this is pure space syntax analysis, so it's just considering the accessibility of streets per se. And this map here is considering our accessibility through streets, but not to streets, but to the contents that are loaded in each side that defines the street. So in each of these street blocks, we would have different contents on the plots. And these qualities of the plots could be, for instance, information about the activities, the economic activities taking place on the ground floor. It could be, for instance, population data like groups of age. But the thing is that here we are considering accessibility only, and here we are considering accessibility to density, or if you want, to diversity. So when we talk about plots, it's inevitable to think how they get together and the street blocks that they form. And one of the books that I found more interesting when talking about street blocks is Forme urbaine de l'îlot à la barre by Jean Castex, Philippe Paneret, and Jean-Charles de Paul. The book was translated to many languages, and surprisingly, it was only translated to English almost 30 years after. And the translation was done by a dear friend of ours who was here probably more than once, Ivor Samuels and his wife, Olga. And the book is great because it shows this powerful transformation that happened in less than a century. How we moved from, in many parts of the planet, how we moved from the organization of the urban space mainly by street blocks to this organization or lack of organization just based on isolated buildings, each year more different, more freestanding, more I don't want anything to do with the surroundings. So this is the key lesson of the book. But one of the secondary lessons that I really appreciate in this book is for, as you know, each part of the book is devoted to a particular moment in planning history, a particular important moment in planning history. And the first one is the transformations taking place in Paris in the mid-19th century, promoted by Haussmann. And one of the things that Jean Castex and his colleagues tell us is that in in this first moment, we still have street blocks, so there is no way that we can say that we don't have street blocks in this new landscape that was being created. But the nature of these street blocks is rather different from the nature of that. Here, everything is much more controlled. The number of plots in which each street block is subdivided is much more reduced. And so what we have in here is more the form of the street block and not so much the whole diversity, the whole process that a street block allows as we have in the first image. In the first image, we would have an irregular, it's not the most important, it could be a regular street block, but it would be made of many different plots. And each of these plots would have one agent, one strategy, and the whole set would be changing at very different rhythms. We would never have this uniform image. Again, I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but the nature of these two street blocks is completely different. So more or less at the same time that in Versailles, Castex, Paneret, and De Paul were looking at how street blocks were transformed over time, Gianfranco Caniggia and Gianluigi Maffei were trying to identify some general aspects that could be taken from their observation of Italian cities to other places. Again, the same logic of MRG Conzena. And here, this is just to show that one group in France and the other group in Italy were portraying more or less the same thing. So here, Caniggia and Maffei, they are telling us that in most cases, the street block is not a form that comes to the ground like that. It is very often a process. We link to different points. Along the way, parts of this street become more important, and so we start to create other streets, and through time, these streets start to create these different street blocks. In my city, in Porto, street blocks are, I would say, most of the times they are made like that. And one very interesting way of understanding this is that in my city, again, when I walk through a street block, the faces are always different because they are made in different time periods. So we could have like 19th century here, then 20th century. Of course, that when I walked through the 19th century, some of the buildings could have been replaced. And so I have 19 and 20, obviously. That's one of the first things that Conzena tells us about, how change happens at different scales. So this is just a conceptual drawing, but we can find an illustration in Rome. So this is Piazza del Popolo here, and more or less here would be Piazza Venezia. So Via del Corso is uniting the two, and what we have in gray is the first moment of the structure. Then in orange, those perpendicular streets that start to create the street blocks, and finally the yellow plots close the street blocks. And so we would have a street block as a process. So this is the area that the drawing refers to. And this image raises a critical challenge in urban morphology and in architecture also, which is how can we understand so many buildings? How is it possible to create, to have a good knowledge of a building culture? Many times, architectural schools, they solve this problem just by focusing their attention on understanding those special buildings that were designed by the star architects of the city, which is okay, but in my understanding, a bit poor. We could do more than that. And our Italian colleagues suggested that one interesting way for understanding a building culture, one interesting way to understand the buildings that make my city is by using the concept of type. So when we walk through a street like that, like Via del Corso, we will not find a type. A type is something that is abstract, it does not exist. But if we walk Via del Corso, we will certainly identify many buildings that are part of a type. So the huge number of buildings that make one part of a city can be reduced to a manageable number of types. Each type would gather buildings that share the same structural characteristics and that at the same time would have differences, but differences that are not very important. Another thing that these colleagues tell us is that when we come to a manageable number of types, for instance 10, 20, we can analyze them and place them in a sequential evolution in time, meaning that one type is the origin to the creation of another type. And we can, based on these very simple diagrams, to start telling the building history of a particular place. And because we are architects, and Gianfranco Canigia was also an architect, we can also use these typological processes, that's the name of the sequence, to route our design proposals and to do something. So here, Canigia and Maffei were looking at the typological process in Genova, and after some years of developing the process, he had the opportunity to make this design in this very difficult site in the surroundings of Genova, and is applying the concept to create this new layout of buildings. If you look carefully, these buildings are a bit postmodern, so they might not attract all of us, but I would say that this is not the most important thing. We could make that structural relation with another architectural style. This is just the cover, the skin. The important thing is to find the common links with each of these typological processes. And to illustrate that, I would use the design proposal of another key urban morphologist named Saverio Muratori. So when Conzena was concluding his study on Anik, Muratori was doing something similar in terms of ambition. The two researchers did not know each other. Muratori, in 1959, he published a book named, in English, Study for an Operational History of Venice. He had a very comprehensive look, supported by the work of many students, on how Venice evolved over time. This included a survey of, I would say, all the buildings that existed in the city in the 50s, which is something absolutely unique and remarkable. And he came to these findings that the building history of the city could be structured in the identification of three key periods where the city was being structured by a particular combination of elements of urban form. By a huge coincidence, I would say, at the time of the publication, there was a competition, a design competition for the expansion. So Venice would be around here, and this would be the extension of the city to accommodate some functions that were hard to fit in the historical part, but also containing residence, of course. So Muratori came up with a very peculiar solution. Today morning, I found that the students of the first year bring to their teachers three or four different alternatives, which I found really great because they are really alternatives. It's not small variation. It's just different things. And through the dialogue with the teacher, they come to select the best one. I found the process really remarkable. Muratori did something similar, which was he did not apply with one proposal to this competition, but he designed three proposals, each of the proposals based on one of those patterns of combination that were identified in each period of time. And he won the first and the third position in this competition. As we know, too often these first prizes do not lead to construction, and that's what happened here. What I'm showing you is the third prize. I like better the third prize than the first one. And what we can see here is that what is trying to recover was or is a time of the life of Venice where we could see it mainly being constituted by small islands with just few connections, and each of the island would have a central public space, and the public space would be mostly made of residence, and then would have a public building. In old times it would be a church. Probably now we wouldn't have so many churches in these islands, but just to say that it is this structural way of organizing space that Muratori was trying to capture, not so much stylistic aspects of architecture. And I would conclude with Anik again. So as Muratori used his book to apply to this competition, also Conzena used his study on Anik to influence the life of the city. But here, the purpose was to avoid things to happen. I'm sure that you are familiar with the fight between Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses in New York. Robert Moses changed completely the face of New York until he met this very fragile, small woman, but very, very strong, that led to the decline of his influence on the city, an influence that has lasted for decades. And so here in New York, the struggle represented the struggle between modernists and a certain way of looking at cities based on people and on the built environments that are done with very careful actions and that assume time in its construction. In a more modest way, Conzena was fighting against the Robert Moses of Anik that by 1965, have already approved this layout, a modernist layout that was so common to all the proposals that were being developed at the time. And by using the book and by influencing a number of citizens in Anik, Conzen did something very similar to what Jane Jacobs has done in New York. She was able to stop the destruction of part of Greenwich Village and Washington Square Park, just to create a motorway and new housing estates. And here, Conzen was able to use the Anik book to conserve this landscape that attracted him some years before. So that would be the end of my talk, and I hope you have enjoyed it.